summit, and we're very pleased to be a partner in the project that's funded by Art Fund. So thank you to Louise and everyone in the team for all their work. It's been a massive amount of work putting this together this week, so well done to all of them. So I've got an amazing panel lined up for you today, and I've got some set questions that we've prepared, but please do ask questions. We want this to be as interactive as possible, so we will feed through any of your questions as we go through. So I'm just going to very briefly introduce the panellists, and then we're going to get cracking with our first question. So I'm delighted that we have Sarah Cameron, who's Head of Heritage Learning at Carlisle Cathedral, away from Sarah. Rhiannon Litterick, who's from the Sir John Stones Museum, and Rebecca Hale from Norfolk Museum Service. And we've got Rachel Moss, who's a freelancer who specialises in education and evaluation. So thank you and welcome to all of you. First question, which I'm going to go to Sarah first, and then we'll go round Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Rhiannon. How did you develop your career in museum learning?
Mine was kind of just a bit of a fluke, if I'm honest. So I started off studying English literature and history at uni because I liked the subjects and I wanted to move away from Cumbria for a while when I was 18. I then realised I wanted to work in history but didn't want to be a teacher, just the irony. So I did a master's in public history at the University of York. And then I volunteered in a lot of different museums. I wasn't fully aware of all the roles, so that was quite difficult. I think I was dreaming up things that didn't really exist. And then I spent quite a long time trying to find job experience, and then it just kind of happened. I got this role in a small museum that were looking for someone part-time for just under 2 years to create a new educational programme. So that's where I got my experience. It's probably quite unusual, really, to get an education role and had done no teaching. The only experience I'd really had has been a volunteer and engaging with people with objects in like exhibition spaces. So then that's where I kind of got a lot of my experience. Quite unusual being a one-person team, especially with no experience. So I had to do a lot of learning, and luckily there's a lot of great people out there that can help when you're starting out. Then went on and did some more participation work in a museum, and then ended up getting this role at Carlisle, which is a new role for the Cathedral, really trying to get new audiences to engage and learn about the kind of the culture and heritage side of the building. So yeah.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So Rebecca, tell us about your experience and your journey.
Great, yeah. So I started at a similar, I did a history degree, but I had the clear ambition of wanting to be a history teacher. So I immediately followed that degree with a PGC in secondary history, and then taught at secondary schools for 6 years, teaching both history and music, which is another kind of love of mine. And I really loved working with the students and telling stories and being really creative. But in that role, I felt quite hamstrung and I would say ethically challenged by such a strong focus on attainment and assessment. And in my role as well, I organised lots of trips out to museums and heritage sites, but also cultural sites in terms of music as well, and really saw the impact that that one-off trip could make to a student and how essential those out-of-school visits were. So I left that career to then think, actually, that's exactly the place I want to work in. And then I undertook an MA in museum studies to help kind of facilitate that move. And I chose one that was really heavily focused on experience, as because during my teaching role, I hadn't had much time to actually volunteer, and I'd only done one voluntary role as an art gallery attendant. So I really tried a wide range of volunteering and employment opportunities alongside my MA year. And at the end of that, I thought, actually, yeah, I definitely want to be in museum learning. I saw it as creative and the engagement opportunities were fantastic. And realistically, I was looking at roles in the museum sector and actually thought I was probably in a strong position to get a learning role rather than anything else because of my teaching background. So I thought realistically, that's probably the best route for me as well. So then immediately after that, I did a maternity cover as an line officer in the museum I work at, and now just over 4 years later, I'm still at that same museum in the same role.
Brilliant, thank you. So moving on to Rachel, slightly different perspective from a freelance perspective. Do you want to talk to us about how you got there and about your freelance work now, Rachel?
Yeah, so I've been working in museums and galleries, specifically education, for the past 20 years. I came I would say a very kind of traditional route, which hopefully we can talk about a bit later, you know, that we're starting to break this down. It's nice to hear other people's routes but I was a primary school teacher, so I did a degree, specifically it was a BA QTS, so that I would teach. I taught for a year, but I'd been volunteering in museums and galleries while I was at university. I was very lucky, my mum took me to museums and galleries. It felt like a place where I felt at home. Wasn't quite sure about the constraints of teaching. I have a lot of respect for teachers, it's a really hard job. So decided that I would do a museum studies master's. So I did 1 year of teaching in a school, did a museum studies master's, and then to get my first museum job, I was living at home for a bit in Southampton, moved all the way up to Burnley because I was really passionate, worked in a small gallery up there, then moved to the Midlands, and I've been in London for since 2001. I can't do my maths today. Since 2001. I've worked at Tate, I've worked at Serpentine Gallery, I've worked at the National Portrait Gallery for 9 years, and then about 5 years ago I decided that I would go freelance, and some of my work is still what I would call arts education. I feel very strongly as an evaluator, which is the other hat I wear, that I need to be able to do some delivery to be able to evaluate as well, rather than just being someone who kind of comes in and evaluates. So I do part arts education and parts evaluation.
Brilliant, thank you. And Rhiannon, do you want to tell us about your journey and where you are now?
So my journey is a lot more meandering than everybody else's. So I graduated in classics, so Latin and Greek, and I knew that I wanted to work in education, and I tutored the whole way through university. And I also knew I really liked old things, but I didn't come out of university with any idea of what careers existed in museums. And as a kid, I was taken to loads because my mum had a period costume business. So I grew up doing a lot of historical reenactment and knew that I really wanted to work in that field, but without a clear idea. And a complete coincidence, a very unusual start, is that the local authority museum where I grew up in Essex was looking for somebody to run some education sessions, abysmally paid. This is over a decade ago, appallingly paid, very ad hoc, and it was someone my mum knew. And so I started doing that, did lots of waitressing and tutoring, thinking, well, my main aim was to get out of the family home at this point. I was enjoying what I was doing, but I thought, well, if I'm going to work in museums, I'm going to do what everyone does and be a curator, knowing absolutely nothing about what that involved. So I interned at Tate Liverpool and realised at the first 15, 20 minutes, just a 3-month unpaid internship where I'd had to move up north, that I'd made a catastrophic mistake, stuck it out, was really interested in what the learning team were doing, but the amazing supervisor I had knew that this wasn't where my heart was. And I came back home hoping to pick up the job that I had left, thinking I was going to make my fortune. And when I came back, the job no longer existed. And so I didn't know what I was going to do. And my sole aim now was to move to London, to have fun with my friends. They were all earning money, it looked fun. And I just fell into educational publishing through a friend of a friend. And I stayed there for 2 years, knowing that this wasn't what I wanted to do, and also knowing that, or feeling like I didn't have the experience to go into museums. So I did a PGCE, and I taught in an all-girls secondary school. I taught Latin and Greek and classical civilization for 2 years in South London. And I knew still that this wasn't quite what I wanted to do, but it was paying the bills. And I was starting to read the Museums Journal again and thinking, well, that's what I want to do. And so I was in the incredibly privileged position, because my husband is the breadwinner in our family, to be able to leave that role to volunteer. I did lots of tutoring to support myself as well, and I volunteered all over London in museum learning and front of house. And I started at Sir John Soane's Museum, a long time ago now, as a volunteer visitor assistant whilst applying for jobs. And I had the 6-month hell of applying for every learning job going, knowing that because I was getting this voluntary experience and I had a PGCE and I was tutoring, I was doing everything. I knew that I had the sort of thing they were looking for, but I wasn't quite getting roles. And just as I was about to give up, somebody who I'd been volunteering under at Benjamin Franklin House said to me, well, why don't you look for front of house roles so you can get your foot in the door? And I got the first front of house casual job that I applied for at Keats House, and it slowly snowballed. So after that, I started this sort of patchwork career, I call my path. So I started a Master's in Socially Engaged Practice at Leicester, which I'm still doing at the moment. And I started at Langley Academy as their sixth form learning officer, because they're a museum learning school, and it was the perfect role. And I also got a job at the Soane as a freelance youth panel facilitator, and thought, right, this is perfect, this is what I want to do. And without warning, at the Soane, a job came up 3 days a week as learning officer. It was covering the youth panel, all the things that I wanted to do. And I thought, well, I've already got the path that I want, but in the back of my mind, I thought, well, maybe having a permanent income would be amazing. Not having to commute from Slough to South London to North London would be absolutely fantastic. And I applied for it and I got it. And at one point, I was working 3 jobs and doing a master's, and realised that for my sanity, much as I wanted to secure my position in the museum learning field, that something had to give. And so I decided that Langley Academy, commuting to Slough, I loved the job, but I didn't feel like I was sitting there, and I wanted to get more experience. And so I now I'm doing my master's. I work part-time at the Soane, and the youth panel has been absorbed into the role, and I'm also doing my master's. So that's my convoluted route into the sector.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. What I love about museum learning is that we're all so connected to each other as well. Like I also did a kind of voluntary work, very early career at the Soane, and then they paid me to do a little project. But my best anecdote about the Soane was it was my job to go to Fortnum & Mason's and buy the biscuits, because tea time at the Soane Museum in those days was a very, very important ritual. So
it still is 4 o'clock. It's still a thing.
Excellent. Good. Right, we're going to move on to another question. Please, everybody that is listening attentively, do write your own questions in the chat if you want to probe anything a bit further, or ask specific panelist specific questions. We'll pick those up as we go. So we're going to move on now to a slightly different type of question, which is about COVID, which I'm sure is on everyone's minds as the tiers have been announced. I was trying to work out if any of our panellists are in a tier 3, but I don't think we are we? Thankfully. But the GEM office is in Kent, so the GEM office is, looks like my trip to the office is off for the moment. But can you all talk about the impact that COVID has had specifically on museum learning, and the current challenges, but also the future opportunities? And I'm going to go to Rachel, if I may, first. And then I'll go Rachel, Rebecca, Sarah, Rhiannon. No, sorry, Rachel, Rebecca, Rhiannon, Sarah for this one.
Thank you. So moving online has been a big thing. Because I'm freelance, I think others will have maybe answers that involve what it's like to be working in a specific venue, which I don't have. A lot of my work is quite remote anyway. You know, one of the reasons I went freelance is that I have 2 children. You can probably tell from my background. And so that's given me a bit more flexibility. And I think that's kind of important to flag up as a freelancer, but people go freelance for all sorts of reasons, but that was the main one for me. But because I do a lot of evaluation, I'm sort of answering this. My evaluation tends to be with learning departments anyway, but one of the things has been this kind of shift onto online learning. And I think a lot of people have found that they're not necessarily equipped. So, you know, I'm talking quite broadly, but museums definitely, you know, may not have the kind of digital resources to be able to do this, or staff might not have the digital skills to be able to do this. Most of us are working from home. We will have Wi-Fi problems and all sorts of things. We talked beforehand, you know, you might have a child running in the room and all sorts of things. So you've got all that kind of stuff kind of going on. And I think also, depending on who you're working with, a lot of the communities that work with museums and galleries could be quite vulnerable, could not have, you know, they might not have any of these digital resources. We talk about digital poverty. So I think there's been quite a lot of challenges with going on moving to digital, but I think there are also some benefits that are coming out of it. So some of the projects that I am evaluating, one of them is that we currently have participants from Nigeria, Austria, all over kind of Europe, Ireland, and this is a London-centric project where usually people walk into a gallery context. So that's brilliant in terms of reach. And secondly, I think some of the sessions that I evaluate are very kind of sensitive conversations. And it means that young people, particularly young people who might identify as being queer, but may not be able to do so within their communities, have been able to participate. And like today, you know, lots of people are muted, their screens are off, people can be anonymous and type into chat boxes. So I think there are some benefits of that. And I think it will be really interesting moving forward. We're talking a lot in museum education about blended learning, this idea that maybe we will move forward digitally but also face to face, because there are benefits to both, and what will kind of happen moving forward. And I know some of the conversations that we're having at the moment, some of the groups that we're working with are desperate to get back to that face to face element because they feel that they're not connecting, but others are like, hey, you know, I can participate from across the world, which is brilliant. So I think that is one of the kind of key things that we're looking at. But I just wanted to flag up that there have been some really great examples of organisations who have managed to stay connected face to face with their communities. The Museum of Homelessness became a kind of COVID hub and have done some amazing work. So if you want to kind of find out a bit more about them. And I used to work at the South London Gallery, so I know that they've been working with children and families on the housing estates and handing out materials and activity packs, and I know that that's been happening in places across the country as well. So yeah, so those are the things that I'd like to talk about. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, and just to throw in, Jem, we've actually got a whole case study publication which is imminently coming off the press, and that will be available freely to everybody, whether you're a member or not, after a brief member period. So that will be all about remote learning. There's a whole load of case studies, including, as Rachel said, some of the non-digital remote learning that's been happening as well. There's also some really good examples on the Culture, Health and Wellbeing Alliance website. If you haven't looked at those, very interesting around the kind of health and well-being type of case studies. Right, Rebecca, I'm coming to you now for the same question about the impact of COVID. So you can talk from your own perspective or more broadly, up to you really.
Yeah, so when I think about this very specifically to the museum I work at, which is Gressenhall Farm and Workhouse, the museum learning that we do there is really great. It's hands-on, it's immersive, it's object and story-led, and has opportunities to engage all. But particularly those first two elements, kind of hands-on, immersive, are really hard to do in a COVID-safe way without also, we've been thinking about it feeling too sterilised an experience for children within those. So we do costume character delivery, we do hands-on sensory theatre-based education. So we've had to rethink a lot of our school sessions. But one positive aspect I think about this time, and anyone in learning will appreciate this, I think, is it's given us time to reflect. And quite often we're so kind of immersed in delivery every single day that we don't have that kind of broadness time to reflect on our service and what we're offering. So what actually we've come to realize is how special a museum visit actually is. And whilst we have planned and delivered some digital learning opportunities, we've actually used this time to really adapt our on-site visits to continue to give children a real special place to connect with the past and today in real terms with real objects. And so we've also used this time to really look at how to embed race and gender far more explicitly into our learning programs. So that's really an opportunity as well that we've had during this year. But as well, to kind of draw on what Rachel said as well, we have as well had reflections from kind of teachers that we consulted with a lot about digital fatigue. And also we're seeing kind of widening inequality at this time as well. So, and again, from their feedback and that consultation, we've put real emphasis more on making sure our on-site offer is going to be really strong. And we all see how democratizing a school visit is. Everyone comes in, everyone experiences this visit, and it could influence obviously their opinions towards museums outside of school. So we've really upped our communication with teachers and that consultation period to reassure them of our new safety elements, but also to discuss with them what would really benefit them. And so I've seen that as a real advantage as well, that communication has got much stronger. But it's also made us think about future ways to make the visits really special, unique and relevant, and include an online offer to complement rather than replace.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Rhiannon, same question around COVID and the challenges and opportunities.
In a similar vein to what's already been said, the biggest challenge to the team for my role has been furlough, because the whole department was furloughed. So most of the Soane staff were furloughed in April. We were allowed to continue to May because we were doing architecture clubs, the weekend clubs and the after school club we run for local kids. They went online. We were doing community projects. And we ended up, April is the hardest I have ever worked, with no childcare and a rampaging toddler and a husband who works for the hours, and we somehow did it. And then furlough, it almost felt, I took it really hard being furloughed, because it's almost like we've worked so hard over the last 3 years to get this programme together, and we just had to turn around and walk away at a moment when some of our audiences, particularly those who were really struggling for all sorts of reasons because of the global pandemic, it almost felt like we were leaving them. And I know, and people kept saying to me, oh, it's just a job, but I felt so invested in it because I found that I've poured my heart and soul into a lot of our programs, and it was good to have some time to reflect. I feel like we came back in August part-time unfurloughed and really prioritised. I feel like the opportunity has come to really evaluate my work-life balance. Oh, sorry, I should be back. And it was good in a way because senior management realised that the learning programme stops if the people delivering it aren't working. And the idea that we need to engage with our audiences, if we're a national, who are we for, why do we do what we do? If there's no one there to deliver it, it can't happen. And I think that has really helped our relationship and our standing within the museum almost. People have appreciated more the work that we're doing. And it also means that now, because we're having to rebuild our schools programme. I found it very difficult when it felt like other museums were doing all these amazing things, and I went to lots of the GEM webinars and had mentoring through the Museums Association. I was hearing about these fantastic things while thinking, well, I can't do anything, and there's such an opportunity here. But I feel the positive of it is that now the relationships that we have got with schools that have visited us virtually or been in touch is much deeper. And I feel as though we're not doing as much at the moment because we're still building back. But what we're doing is more bespoke things, and we're going much deeper into that relationship. So although it has been difficult and there have been lots of challenges, I now feel like the opportunities are outweighing it, but it's taken me a while to feel like that.
Great, thank you. Sarah.
Rhiannon's so right when it comes to furlough and how rubbish it makes you feel. I've definitely struggled feeling like I'm just not doing enough. Even though you furlough, you literally can't do anything, and now feeling behind. So there are things that all these wonderful museums that it's so great seeing them really like go forward, but I feel left behind because I still haven't been able to learn the things that they had to do so quickly, and they all work so hard. So you want them to continue going forward, but you do also feel like, oh, are we just not doing enough for our area? One of the things I think's a benefit is outreach. So there's been museums for years and years that have done fantastic outreach. In a lot of other museums, there sometimes can be a sense of if that person's not physically in that building, it doesn't count. You're not engaging with them. So now I think museums are seeing the benefit of outreach or doing things remotely. So I'm hoping that can continue. and be valued more, because I think it wasn't valued in all organisations. So hopefully it can be that blended approach. That means more people can benefit, because there's so many museums that I absolutely love and I've never visited because I live in Cumbria. I can't go to London every day, or the southeast, the southwest. It's difficult, but now I can actually be more involved in their collections and what they're doing, and I think that's really a great benefit.
That's great, thank you. And also it's made me think about loan boxes. So loan boxes sort of have gone out of fashion like big time, but they've come back with a massive resurgence, partly because the government specifically mentioned them. It was nice they mentioned something that was museum learning related. But it's also another way of engaging during this time. So we've been doing some work with Leeds Museums and Galleries. They've got a big loan box service of real objects that they send out. So again, if you want to have a look at an example of that, do look to Leeds, and there are others as well. I'm going to just jump to a question from the floor, as it were, the virtual floor, from Kirsty. So she's saying, I'm doing my, and I think, can I ask the panel to put their hand up if they want to answer it? I'm doing my Master's in Museum Education and lots of volunteering. Is there anything else you would recommend doing to help secure a role in museum learning? Sorry if that was a bit garbled. So yeah, what else can she do as well as her MA in volunteering? Rachel? Oh, Rachel and then Rhiannon. Yeah.
Hi, just quickly, I just put in the chat box actually, which could relate to this. Emily asked a question about where to go for advice and training, and GEM, which Rachel Tranter is obviously part of, and Engage have been an absolute vital thing for me over the past 20 years. So I would say one of the key things would be to network. Me as a freelancer, this is how I get my work. I have lots of coffees with people, Zoom coffees at the moment and things like that, and it doesn't always lead straight to work, but just getting to know people. Get on Twitter. Rhiannon and I are on Twitter a lot together, and Sarah, museum hour on a Monday night. There's lots of kind of things you can do where you just kind of get to know people, and obviously at the moment it's more difficult face to face, but check out Engage and GEM. They're both relatively cheap to be part of. I went to a free seminar earlier in the week, doing things like this, but some of the sessions are more participatory, where you're in smaller groups and you can see each other and chat. So I think networking is key. Obviously that's tricky if you're an introvert, but there are other ways to do that, maybe via Twitter and things where you're a little bit more anonymous, I guess.
Right, Rhiannon?
I was going to say mentoring has been really crucial for me. So the Museums Association have run it, if you remember, GEM have run it. I had some fantastic mentoring earlier this year with somebody who's much more senior than me, and it really made me think about my role, so that might be useful. And I was also going to say, if there is anybody on Twitter or that you come across that you think, their job sounds amazing, I wish I could do that. If you offer to take people for a coffee or a virtual Zoom with a promise of a coffee later on, a lot of people in the sector will happily talk to you. It's the most caring, sharing place I've ever come across. I've got to know people like Sarah and Rachel through Twitter. If you just drop someone a message, the worst thing they can say is no, they haven't got time. But if there is someone who you think you could really learn from, just ask them, and I'm sure a lot of people will help you. And it's very flattering to be asked as well, so I don't think people will turn you down. People love to talk about themselves and to help.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as an employer, because before GEM, I was based at Orleans House Gallery for a long time and employed a lot of different people in our learning service that developed over the years. I think what you need is some real experience, so real examples. So you need to be able to say, I did this, I led that session, and be very tangible about your examples if you do secure an interview, and make sure that when you do your application, that again, you do it absolutely tied to the job application that you've got on. So you don't send just a general thing out, you be very, very specific. You write it in the order of their person spec. That's like my biggest key message. Always write it in their order. Don't deviate, don't do your own order, do it in their order according to their person spec, and just come up with the very, very specific examples of real work experience, because unfortunately an AMA is not enough. You will need substantial experience to get on the ladder and get that first job. Next question, I think I'm going to here's one of my questions. So can you tell us about, if you've got a team, have you all got teams? Can you wave if you've got a team? Not everybody's got a team. So for those of you that have got a team and want to answer this, can you tell us about a bit about your learning team and the different job roles that they cover, they include? Or other people you work with, like volunteers, if you don't have an employed team. Sorry. Who wants to, should we go to Sarah first?
I don't have a team. I do everything at the moment. Hopefully eventually, because we're a new programme building up, we'll get volunteers. So I have to rely more heavily on other areas of the cathedral, which is also quite good, because it is just me. I don't end up huddled just with learning people. I have to talk to, you know, our head of visitor services, our events manager, which I think helps in the sense that you need to embed learning into the organisation, and some are fantastic at this, some aren't. Learning's working its way up to being more respected, but I think you need to voice what you're doing. But yeah, no team, so I can't help on this.
Sorry, I was just not paying attention then. Rebecca.
Yes, I do have a team, yeah. So we have, within it, we have one full-time learning officer post, which I job share on. That role is to deliver and develop the formal, informal learning and outreach learning offer, as well as manage the learning volunteers. We then have a learning manager. They're based at the museum I work at, but they're actually the manager for the Western area museums, because we're part of the Norfolk Museum Service. So they manage 4 museums, and also, which I really like, their aspect of the role, they also regularly deliver the formal learning school offer at the museum I work at as well, because they see that as essential for them kind of reviewing and evaluating. We then have a learning interpreter post, which is term time and part-time only. They predominantly focus on delivery and working with freelancers. And then we have a part-time learning administrator post to help with bookings and communications with schools. And then we also currently have a project worker who's our Kick the Dust Youth project officer, who's again part-time, and making sure we're directly connecting with that 11 to 25-year-old group.
Great, thank you. I'll come to Rhiannon and then I'll have Rachel at the end to talk about freelance, which is a bit different. So Rhiannon.
So at the Soane, there are 2 of us. There's a learning manager who is my line manager. So she's 2.5 days a week. Sorry, and then my role, learning officer, I work 3.5 days a week. We then have a team of 9 freelancers. So we have a pool of them that we use for schools, and then we have freelancers who work on individual projects. So we have 2 who run weekend architecture clubs, 1 who does after school. We have 1 that does our second Saturday monthly family workshop, and we have 1 that runs our architectural drawing course for older students. And the rest of the team, they tend to be artist educators. Some of them have been at the museum for 20 years, some of them are much more recent. We find that whenever we recruit for a role, we end up with lots of brilliant people. So sometimes what has happened is if we've had 2 fantastic people and only 1 job, we'll take 1 person for the job and the other add to the pool, and that's been amazing. And they have lots of different backgrounds. So we have artist educators, half have PGC, half don't, and they've all got very different routes into the sector, but it means that we've got a really dynamic team and we really rely on their expertise, even though there's only 2 of us trying to run schools, families and all communities part-time.
Brilliant. And Rachel, how does it work? Because are you part of a collective or is it just you?
So it's just me as a freelancer, but some of the organisations I've been working with for a long time. So I sort of, a little bit like Rhiannon was saying, you know, that some organisations, when they've got small teams, kind of have freelancers as an extension of those teams as well. But I think for me, I'm a bit long in the tooth. I think I'm a bit older than everybody else here, and so I've been the person who works on their own. I was the education person. I've worked in teams of 3. I've also worked in a team of about 15, 20. So when I started at the National Portrait Gallery, and I was there for 9 years, I was probably about the 5th member of staff, I think, in the team. And when I left, there was at least 15 of us. And I know that there has been restructuring since. But just to give a kind of sense of some of the breadth of jobs, because you could be an education person and kind of work with everybody, which I really enjoy doing. But also, if you find that there's an audience you particularly like working with, I was a young people's programs manager. There was somebody at National Portrait Gallery who worked specifically with families, someone who worked specifically with adults, as in public programming, somebody who did access, so that included working in hospital schools with young carers. We had 2 people who did schools, one primary, one secondary, and we had someone who wrote resources. We had a digital person, which, you know, at the moment would be absolutely fantastic if you had someone digital actually sat within your team. I'm bound to have forgotten somebody. Oh, the people who sorted all the kind of bookings, which is absolutely key, which is quite a kind of administrative kind of role, but absolutely key in a big education team to have people who are able to do that. And then we also had someone who was more interpretation, which was really interesting, because in a way she could have sat in other areas. She could have sat in exhibitions, but she sat in the education department and was a really good bridge for us in terms of having conversations with the curatorial and exhibitions teams. And her role was very much around looking at the writing for the text panels, the audio guides, leaflets and things like that. So I think, you know, you can have a job where you kind of do a bit of everything, and I've done those jobs and I am the education person, it's just me. But equally, I've been in jobs where, right, I'm working with one audience in quite a specific way, and that's been interesting too.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of people's experience, like from you know, mine as well. When I actually came through a curatorial route, that I sort of developed all of the learning programs at Orleans from scratch and sort of gradually built up a team. So never actually had education in my title, but done loads of it. And you know, I was going to do a session, we haven't done this session, about making leadership fun, which was about the importance of, you know, like you said, Rachel, keeping up with your practice and being involved. So, you know, I used to always go and hand out the certificates, you know, for Arts Award, or go and hang out with the kids having their pizza in the youth club, just so that, you know, I felt connected to what was going on, as well as sitting and doing all the other things I had to do as head of arts. Right, I've got a question about the difference between teaching in schools and museum learning, which is quite interesting because some of you have got teaching qualifications. What do you think? Who should I start with? Gosh, I'll start with Rachel maybe for this one. You know, what do you think the difference is between being a teacher and teaching in museum learning?
I made some notes on this because I've been trying to think about this quite a lot. So I think originally museums tended to focus on working with schools audiences, and I'm thinking back quite a long way. This isn't a plug because I don't get any revenue out of this, but about 10 years ago I wrote a chapter for a book called How to Get a Job in a Museum or Art Gallery, and I thought it was interesting thinking about today, and I've been sort of looking back and reflecting on what I wrote 10 years ago about how you could get into education roles. So I think, you know, I think originally museums and galleries predominantly worked with schools, and some museums will sort of see this as a bit of sort of bread and butter. These are audiences that we can work with who really want to engage with us. And now we've diversified much more broadly, as I talked about. Some people are working with young people or vulnerable community groups or all sorts of audiences. So I think that's the first thing. I think secondly, having been a teacher, teaching is really difficult. I'm not saying that we don't have difficult jobs too, but I do think it's difficult. And I think teachers have to meet the curriculum. And when I worked at Tate on the schools programme many years ago, we talked about challenging the curriculum. So looking at what teachers are doing in the curriculum, so trying to support teachers, but also to kind of challenge it and mix it up a bit, because within museums and galleries, you do want to kind of present things that teachers might be interested in because you want the schools to come and visit or whatever, but at the same time you don't have the same kind of accountability. You don't have Ofsted kind of checking in with you. So there's that kind of freedom. And I think, what was the other thing? Oh, the other thing is that teachers with their classes predominantly every day, I'm thinking primary school teachers, for example, and a lot of museums and galleries don't have that kind of luxury. You might only meet somebody once, and so working with teachers or key workers from community organisations or youth organisations is absolutely key. Like, they are brilliant, they know their audiences, they know what they're doing, they're specialists in their field, and so it's really important, I think, to work with teachers in that way.
Brilliant. Does anybody else want to chip in on the difference between learning and teaching and museum learning? Rebecca? Yeah.
Yeah, because one of the lots of things as well that Rachel picked up there, but I think one of the main things that's been a key difference for me was teaching in schools was really based on a very long-term relationship, and you're continually building up that knowledge and skills relating to most time a specific subject. And the best teachers that I know of really know their students really well. They've got a fantastic relationship with them and will personalise learning to them. And you're often in a role, and this is what makes it really hard as well, of personal support as much as teaching the subject and skills. And it's based on outcomes, progress, and those are set from assessment criteria. But museum learning, in the majority of cases, is often, especially with schools, a very short-term relationship with children. So you see them kind of for a session or a day. So you're providing really quick engagements that are really memorable, really exciting and hands-on. And often there's an emphasis on local stories and using real objects from the past. I think museum learning has that real lovely capacity to have real contemporary relevance and make that connection between the past and today in a very cross-curricular way, which then maybe school as well teachers are a bit more restricted by. But I think it's based on, museum learning is based on the learning, and there's a real freedom in exploring that and having real experiences, and then also meeting new people as well.
Great. Rhiannon and Sarah, do you want to chip in on this one, or no? Rhiannon? Yep, go on then.
I was going to build on what already has been said, and I was going to say particularly I was a secondary school teacher, and the key difference I found when I started running the Soane Youth Panel was the style of facilitation skills. It's different from teaching a sixth form lesson and working with young people, and I have to keep remembering that it's not school. They're choosing to be there, which to some extent, you know, up in sixth are choosing to be there, but it's different. They're choosing to be there, and it's about the teacher-student relationship can be quite didactic, and it can be the teachers teaching and the students are learning and joining in, but the teacher's in charge. Whereas with the youth panel, we've really looked into co-production and how we make it more equitable, and that we are making sure that it's their panel, not ours, because they're giving up their time and want to gain experience. So what, you know, I can't just be their gatekeeper. It's about developing that relationship. And also I was going to say, I completely agree with what Rebecca was saying about the idea that teachers really know their students. And I think what's great about museums is that you're in a formal learning session with school children, you are an expert in whatever it is you're talking about. In their eyes, even if you don't, you know, I sometimes teach rocks and soils and think, gosh, I really need to learn the rock cycle. But you can be curriculum focused. We always try to make sure we've got learning objectives like they would do in school, because the reason that a lot of teachers can take trips, and know this from my experience, is because they're so closely linked to a curriculum topic that you can build on it and you can go beyond in a way that there might not be time in the classroom. And I think that's a key difference. If you can have a little digression, or I know you're studying this Greek vase, let me show you this one as well because it's interesting, and you can really develop it. And that's what's different. We have the luxury of time in some respects, because we don't have to bang through a curriculum in the way that teachers do.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Those are all really, really good points. I'm just picking up on one thread in the chat that's come through about master's degrees. My personal view as somebody that's employed a lot of people is that I don't think it actually matters too much what your master's degree, and as long as it's not a completely different topic. Often that's not really part of the assessment criteria when you're shortlisting anyway. It's good to see that you've got a degree or master's, but also academic qualifications shouldn't be a barrier to these kinds of jobs either, because they're not always necessary. It's not always necessary to have a master's, so we should all be committed to encouraging people, you know, without all those qualifications to apply as well. And I think you have to do the masters that you want to do, not just for your future career, but because, you know, you're going to get something out of it, enjoy it. So I think we've all probably got different, as we've said, different experiences of masters. I did my masters at the Courtauld Institute of Art because I was very into art history, and it was the first time that they did a master's in museum studies, and it just had different elements. So it did include some education, and we worked very closely with the Courtauld, and we did a little exhibition. So I chose that one because it was art specific. So I think you've got to kind of go with your gut of what you're really interested in. If you're going to commit to that much money and to that training for a year and do a dissertation, it's got to be something that you really want to do. I don't know if anyone wants to chip in on that subject of masters and job career progression. Okay, we're going to go on to the last question that I have, which was actually fits quite well to this, which is about barriers to progression in a learning role. Do you think there are barriers to progressing on from a learning role? And what's your advice in terms of overcoming these? So I suppose I was thinking about the fact that we often celebrate when somebody that we think's come from learning it goes into director job, and we go woohoo, like Esme in Manchester, because they're few and far between. So I suppose I was thinking about that level, but also we could talk about barriers at conventory level as well, if you like. So sorry, I will go to Rhiannon first, trying to mix it up.
So barriers to progression. Something I found really interesting is that when I've spoken to friends who work in the sector, and I said, you know, I'm always interested to learn about leadership roles and directorship, and they said, well, you're in learning. How you become a museum director is you're either a curator with a PhD, or you work in commercial. And I always think, well, why do people assume that? Because, you know, you can lead a museum and not have in-depth knowledge of every single aspect. You know, I know plenty of museum directors who've got no clue about the ins and outs of museums education, but can still be very supportive and interested and involved in it. And I think that's changing now. There are people in museum learning who come from museum learning who have risen, but I don't think it's as common. I'm not entirely sure why that is. I think there can occasionally be a preconception that learning is warm and fluffy and you might not be very strategic, but I think that's rubbish, to be honest. I know from institutions that I've worked at that sometimes museum learning can be a little bit of an afterthought. When there are redundancies, it can be one of the first things to go. So maybe that's the mindset, but I'm not entirely sure. But I totally agree with what Rachel was saying. When I see someone from museum learning has made it to the top, I'm always absolutely thrilled, because we're the best, obviously.
Yeah, I'm just wondering as well, do you think it's because we're not ambitious enough? That's, you know, we like doing the teaching too much, you know, we like doing the stuff. Anyway, I'll go to Sarah next. So what's your take on progression?
I agree. I do think that learning and front of house roles have always been the younger sibling of the museum world that's sometimes overlooked, which luckily it seems at the moment this is becoming changed. You know, people are starting to really appreciate, although redundancies is also putting that back into, you know, that maybe we're not. What annoys me about that though is that if you work in learning, the skills you've got are all skills that would help in other museum roles. So you are storytellers, you are doing interpretation because you're getting facts and you're forming it how you want it. You plan events, you plan activities, you create health and safety documents, you do safeguarding policies, you're marketing things, you're evaluating them, you're delivering these to people of all different ages and tailoring it perfectly. You could have 5 different age groups in an audience and you're making sure they're all interested. So why these skills wouldn't give you other roles, I'm not really sure, but maybe it's that people, and I'm bad at this myself, don't promote those as much. Actually, these are the skills we have from learning, and that's why you would be good in other roles if that's what you wanted to do. I think it's really seeing the value. It isn't, like Rhiannon said, just you pop in for the love of it and you know, kids smile back at you and it's all roses. There's a lot of hard work goes into it, and I think maybe we need to start voicing that more.
Quite right. Rebecca? Okay, Rebecca, then Rachel.
Yeah, so Yeah, so I agree with that. There can be some barriers to moving from kind of, I found, I'd like to progress. I'm at that stage now where I've done 4 years and I had 6 years before, and I'm thinking actually I progressed much more quickly in my teaching career than I have done in my museum career. So I'm at that stage now where I'm looking to get those skills, but there are skills in the kind of leadership roles, such as kind of finance management, budget management, that I only come across in a very small way. So what I've tried to do is do a lot of CPD courses whilst in my role to develop those particular skills. So I've just completed an AMA that I actually asked my institution to pay for, which they agreed to. And I focused a project on that skill that I wanted to do. And also a plug for the GEM Foundation Learning course for museum learning that also has that element. There's a work-based project that is led by you. So you can then focus on the skills that you need. And also your organisation has to support you because they have to agree to that upfront. And I'm also completing as well the Extend Leadership course, which again is focused specifically on those skills needed for that next stage. And kind of final tip as well for those, if you're doing those courses, make sure the people in your institution know that you are. So they know that you are ambitious, they know that you're doing that course, and they know that what you're focusing on, but also showing that you want to continue professionally, you have skills to bring at that next level as well. So I would say always shout about, in the courses that you're doing.
Brilliant, thank you. Rachel, we've got about 5 minutes, so this might be our last question. We'll see if we've got time for any more, but Rachel, talking about progression.
Yeah, I agree with quite a lot of what's been said, so I'm not going to duplicate that because I know we're short on time. But two things. One sort of relates back to what Rachel was saying before. Maybe I could talk a bit about entry level. And I know in the chat box, a lot of people have been saying, do you need an MA? Do you not need an MA? That kind of thing, or a teaching qualification. I sat on a panel this morning, which was about making applications to museums and galleries more accessible, and I do quite a lot of work around paid traineeship. So for people who are early careers, you don't necessarily need to be a young person, but early careers, a paid traineeship is a role that you might want to look at. And we talked a lot this morning in the session about asking for equivalent experiences, or qualifications, but explaining a bit about what that could be. So you don't need a master's or a teaching qualification for a lot of jobs. I do still see it. I'm hoping it will change. When I started 20 years ago, you did. That's what you needed. But I think there is a lot of change in practice, and obviously Fair Museums has been brilliant in terms of calling out when people put up applications, do you really need these qualifications? So that's the first kind of thing. And then the second thing I would just wanted to talk about is that I'm an evaluator. So the question that Rachel was asking is, are there any barriers to progressing from a learning role? And I've sort of naturally bridge these two kind of worlds now. And as a learning person, I was always kind of evaluating what I did. And I know a lot of people will do that in education, not just education, but it became quite natural for me to move across into an evaluation role. And I think if you are within an organisation and you're really interested in other areas of work, go and talk to people, in other areas like curatorial or whatever you're interested in. But from what I have seen is a lot of people who might be within one organisation are interested in getting promoted or moving to another part of the organisation. I've seen a lot of people who've kind of gone away, done something else somewhere else and come back again, which I think is quite interesting as well, in bigger organisations anyway.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So I think we're almost going to wrap up. I'm just wondering whether there were any other questions. What time is it now? Gosh, we've only got 2 minutes. So we might have to wrap up. Unless anybody wants to have a final word on anything, I think we might say that we'll draw things to close. We can all go and have some lovely lunch or whatever it is that you're doing this afternoon. Ashley, shall I hand back to you to wrap up? Can I just, before we do that, thank our brilliant panel. You've been amazing and full of so much knowledge, and yeah, been very generous about sharing your experiences. So thank you to Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel and Rhiannon. You've been a fantastic panel. Clap yourselves.
The one disadvantage of Zoom is that we can't actually clap at the end of a conference session, but I'm sure everyone's clapping wherever they are in the world. Thank you so much to our panel. Thank you so much to Rachel Tranter from GEM for running a fantastic session. And I think it was a really interesting discussion. And I think we can tell from the chat that people have been really engaged, and we hope it was useful for all of you. And thank you to all of the attendees for all of your great questions and great conversations and comments as well. We will be saving the chat to share anything useful later, but you can also save the chat yourself if you want to save some of the resources that were shared or get in touch with any of the panelists. So that is the end of our session. We will be putting up the recording as soon as we can, and you can watch it again on YouTube once it's ready. So thanks so much again, everyone, and we hope to see you at other events this week at the summit.
Thank you.